What if every conversation was like a play? What if we could understand persuasion by analyzing the roles, the setting, and the motives behind the actions? Well, that's exactly what Kenneth Burke's theory, dramatism, invites us to do. Welcome back to Communication Campus. I'm your host, Dr. Malynnda Stewart, and today we are exploring Kenneth Burke's Dramatism. Burke argued that communication is a symbolic action, not just transmitting information, but acting with words. By viewing communication as drama, we can better understand the motives and the persuasion that's used. Now, we have to remember that communication really is symbolic. Words aren't neutral. They shape reality. And the words that we choose need to be used purposefully. My favorite saying is say what you mean and mean what you say, meaning I don't say things just randomly. I say them with a purpose. And whether or not I'm really thinking about my purpose or I'm just spouting off can make the difference between effective communication and really problematic communication. Burke also believes that life is drama. Messages can be analyzed as performances. That is, all of this is one big performance. And to understand persuasion, we have to look at the motives behind the actors. Why did they choose those words? Why did they say that the way that they say that? And that's what we're here to explore using this theory. Now, Burke has a famous pentad of 5 elements. That's kind of like a playwright breaking down a script. So first we have the act. What happened? What was the action? So for example, we might take a protest march. That is what happened. Next, we have the scene. Where did it happen and when did it happen? We commonly think about this as the context. All right, so this protest march took place in front of City Hall during an election year. Now, why might that scene, that context, have an impact? And why does an election year make a difference? What if it was just a regular Sunday? Would that change the situation that's occurring? Take that one step further and say it's in front of City Hall the day before a big case is about to happen at City Hall, or the day after a murder took place. How might those things change the scene? I just want you to think about that for a minute. The third piece of the pentad is the agent. Who performed the act? Who is the character? Now, in this case, it's probably the local activists. But what side are they on? What are they saying? Which we'll get to in a minute. But who are they? Where is their background? Who are the characters? Next, we have agency. How was this done? What were the means? Well, in this case, they probably organized through social media. Maybe they gave out posters. Maybe it was just an organization that they all got together and then walked down to City Hall. But what was actually done and how was it done is going to be the means. Lastly, we have the purpose. Why was this done? What was the motivation for this to occur? And if we're going to go with our protest, maybe they were demanding some form of policy change. But if you're also hearing really closely, and if you've ever studied anything with journalism, you should be hearing that really what we're getting at with this pentad is the who, what, where, when, why, and how. That's really what we're getting to with this, with the act, the scene, the agent, the agency, and the purpose. What, where, who, how, and why are really what we're getting at here. But by analyzing these 5 elements, we can uncover underlying motives about how persuaders frame elements and events to shape the audience's interpretation of what's happening. Now, Burke also suggests this idea of ratios. Now, how one element influences another. So, for instance, a scene act ratio emphasizes how the context shape the behaviors. So, where did this thing take place and how that might impact what was actually being done? Now, the agent act ratio highlights how person's character drives their actions. So if we think about the scene, maybe all of these people start rioting. It becomes really violent and people start getting into fights. Well, Burke would argue that this was a scene act ratio because they had all of these people together, all of that emotional fuel, and somebody said the wrong thing or they misinterpreted, and next thing, a fight broke out. Versus, you might say, well, this fight broke out because these bad actors, maybe somebody from an opposing side, came to the protest and they created a spark that ignited into these fights actually happening. These choices reveal persuasive framing. This is where the blame on the situation or blame being put on the purpose or the blame being put on the person. That's where these ratios are going to come into play. How are we telling this story and how are we explaining what happened by looking at where that blame lies? Now, dramatism is powerful because it helps us analyze public discourse, political speeches, advertisements, even everyday conversations. And it reminds us that communication isn't neutral. It's a performance with motives, roles, and consequences. So, to sum this all up, Burke saw communication as symbolic actions, a lot like drama. This pentad, these 5 steps, helps us to analyze the act, the scene, the agent, the agency, and the purpose. By studying the ratios, we see how persuasion frames meaning. All right, I hope this gives you a good overview of dramatism. Thanks again for joining me in this episode of Communication Campus. Our next episode, we're going to get even more into those stories with the narrative framework. And we're going to explore how this narrative, the stories that we tell, are persuasive in communication. Until then, I need you to remember that every message tells a story. And dramatism helps us see that drama in everyday life. Until next time, keep communicating.